2 months, I talked about chapter 1, which was all about conceptualizing the story and coming up with a direction using worship series rather than one-hit wonders, so that we can steep in a message over time and go deeper and deeper into it. The second webinar was on chapter 2, which was about gathering the team. And last month we talked about, blowing up the stereotypes of what a team is. And not thinking it has to be sort of the stereotypical worship committee that's committed to all year long. That we can, invite people to tasks that match their passions. And so both of those webinars are on my YouTube channel. So if you missed those, go back and watch those. This makes sort of a great companion to the book. Also want to remind you that all throughout the book, in the margins, I have these little things that say go to thinklikeafilmmaker.com to look at the bonus materials. And I want to make sure that you do that because there are a ton of materials there that really make a wonderful study as you go through. Because, I can't just put words on a page. I have to give you some videos and some other things to go with it, some photos, especially around the visual arts, right? So be sure that you go to thinklikeafilmmaker.com. There is a form there that you fill out. And then we send you an email with the links to all of the chapter materials. That's how that works. Okay, so friends, this week we're going to talk about the visual arts, which is chapter 3, called Think Like an Art Director. Before we get to that, I want to invite you, if you have not already seen something about it, I want to let you know that September 11th, just right around the corner, I'm going to be doing 6 weeks of coaching through weekly materials. I'm going to be incorporating things from the book. So if you want to go even deeper than just these little monthly webinars, if you want to go even deeper, I'm going to take you through 5 reboot basics that are going to improve your worship right now, and we're going to get you ready for Advent and Christmas all at the same time. So go to worshipreboot.com to find out more about that, but that's yet another way that you can go deeper. All right, so visual arts, that's what we're about today. Chapter 3, Think Like an Art Director. I put that first in the lineup of the 5 chapters that go through the 5 worship arts that we use in the Worship Design Studio. Visual arts, verbal arts, music arts, media arts, and dramatic arts. And I put visual arts first because I think it's one of the most important things that we can do in the worship design process. After writing the synopses, which we talked about on the first month webinar, writing the synopses for your team, pastors, to get them all on board about exactly where we're going. After that, I think one of the most important things to do is to come up with a visual, a metaphor, what I call an anchor image, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. An anchor image, something visual to help sort of use as a symbol of the main message, something that's going to really stir our imaginations. Now, when I talk to filmmakers, one of the things that art directors said, and you'll read this in the book, one art director said it's the second most important thing on a film, the art direction. He said the actors make the film, the acting makes the film, good acting, not just the actors, but good acting makes the film, but the art direction makes the actors. Now, what does he mean by that? What I think he means by that, and what I think is the role of visuals in worship, is that visuals create that world into which we bring the story. Just like the actors in a film are bringing the story alive, the art directors are creating a world in which they can really find their character. They can find the setting. They can find the motivation. And I believe that's what happens with the visual arts, because one of the very first things that I talk about in the book, these are the subheadings here that you see in the slide, is the space, our worship spaces. Space is something that our bodies read right away. And what I mean by read is that when you walk into a room, you get an immediate hit. You get an immediate perception of what that space feels like. Space has a feel. And that's true of your sanctuaries. Now, here's the thing. Many of us have been living in our sanctuaries for so long. I hope you're not living in it, but you know what I mean. Living, worshiping in that space for so long that we don't see it anymore. It becomes second nature to us, and so we stop really noticing about it. But guaranteed, when visitors come into your space for the first time, they are reading the entire space. So one of the first things that I suggest in the visual arts chapter is that you spend some time going into your space and looking at it as if it's for the first time. Now, I'm going to suggest something a little wacky, but it really helps. And that is, if you're having a hard time really seeing it because you've just seen it for so long, put on some binoculars. And I don't mean real ones. I mean these right here. You just make little binoculars because it creates a frame. I know. Can you believe it? It creates a frame, or even just one maybe, and close one eye. That's even better. That's an even better frame. And start looking around your space. Because what it does, it makes you look at details. It makes you look at things through a lens, right? So make yourself a movie camera lens, and start filming through your imagination. And start to notice things about your space. In the book, I put lots of ways you can notice about the lines, about the, is it fluid or is it firm? What about the color and the textures? What are all of those things saying as people walk into that space? It's really important to know our spaces, because to know our spaces helps us to think about what we can do in them that creates a different feel for every series. So I highly recommend that you sort of go into your space, look at it as if for the first time, pretending you're a visitor, and sort of look around. Here's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that the space has become a bit cluttered. We accumulate things, and we don't notice that there's stuff around the space. Look for stuff. Look for things that might have been sitting there for a long time. A stack of books that's sitting next to the piano, and you don't really see it, but all of a sudden you see it, and you go, oh, well, do I really need that stack of books there? Little things like this. Also notice how many lines cut through the space. One of the very first things that happened when Protestants began incorporating visual arts back into worship, and I talk a little bit about that history in the book. But we put banners up. Banners are great, but banners are two-dimensional, and sometimes with too many squares in the space, you might have a lot of architecture that's also lines and squares. Look around, and do you see a ton of lines and boxes? That may be an indicator that when you start to think about what you'll put in your space, you might want to have some things that are fluid and flowing and cut across those lines rather than adding more boxes. So again, looking at your space through a new lens. Okay, so the next part of the book chapter that I talk about is called the ethos. And ethos is a word that we use to describe the feel of something. And in this section, I talk about that every series should have its own feel. Now, here's the huge difference between art directors and worship visual designers, and that is that we work in the exact same space all the time, right? We don't have the luxury of saying, oh, let's go find a house that looks right for this, or let's go find a beautiful flowery field or a running stream. We have to create it in our space. But actually, that's the fun and challenging part, is to take the same space that you have all the time and then create something different for a series. Now, I'm saying for a series because in the previous chapters, I talk about one of the gifts of series is that you're not doing something new, visual artists, every week. That is not sustainable. That's the problem with doing sensory-rich worship as one-hit wonders week after week, is that you can't sustain it unless that's all you do with your life, week after week. So we're talking about creating an ethos, a feel, a palette, let's say, for a series. Now, it may tweak a little bit from week to week, but the whole thing is not going to change. So we're going to think about color. I talk a lot about color in this section about ethos, because color is emotion. And as soon as we walk into a space, the color will either make it feel like an intimate space, a bright space, a cool and open meditative space. It will create a certain feel. And we want that feel to match sort of the feel of the series and of the message. So if you're going to have a very contemplative kind of series, you want to use those colors like greens and blues that offer an open feel and a very calm feel. But you wouldn't want to use that same palette, say, for an Easter season where you want the energy to just explode, right? Blues and greens are not going to explode in the same way that oranges and reds and yellows and that kind of vibrancy will do. You're going to think about scale, you're going to think about texture, all of these kinds of things in terms of the ethos of your series. Now, I go on to talk about symbols. Symbols are so vitally important to worship. If we stay all in our head, cognitive concepts that you can write out in sentences, or that you have to write out in sentences, or explain in depth, then we lose a little bit of the mystery of what worship is. Art directors use symbol so much. Symbols are some of the first ways that we communicated as humans. Drawings on rocks. Now, just west of my house is Donner Pass, of the famed Donner Party. Donner Pass, very high in the mountains here. And on the rocks are very, very ancient petroglyphs. And they're just etched into the rocks. And when you think about how much snow we get up here and how much weather, and the fact that these things have lasted for thousands of years, unbelievable. Now that's art to last a lifetime and beyond, right? But what's interesting about those is that is our first communication. Symbol is so very important. Symbols are close to our heart. We are symbol makers as humans. We will find ways to make symbols. And so, it's very important for us to use ancient symbols, traditional symbols in our worship, but also to take those traditional symbols and help us to see those in a little different way, perhaps. For instance, what I'm talking about is perhaps you have an Advent wreath every Advent, but perhaps this season you're going to use our worship design studio series that we're working on right this minute called God Bless Us Everyone, the Redemption of Scrooge, that sort of uses that classic Dickens tale, A Christmas Carol. And perhaps instead of your usual Advent wreath, perhaps the candles are going to be in lanterns that people might have carried when they didn't have electricity back in the 1800s when A Christmas Carol was written. So these traditional symbols may be seen in a little different way to sort of wake us up to it. That's not the usual Advent wreath. Oh, what's that about? It draws us in. It adds a layer to the story, right? And carrying a lantern around saying, how can I see where I'm going? That'll preach, right? That will preach. So a symbol, as simple as that a visual arts team decides to draw in for a series can become fodder for a pastor. That's when the getting gets good, is when the visual arts are helping the verbal arts to really express something new. So symbols are so vitally important. I tell the story in the book about my first tattoo when I turned 40. So I invite you to read that because it really gets at how symbols have these layers. They have different meanings. And that's what's really yummy about symbols, is that they don't just mean one thing. We don't have to explain them to death. We might want to encourage folks to understand why it is that we're using lanterns instead of the little taper candles this season, if they're not quite getting it. But lanterns, an old lantern might remind somebody of the lantern that their grandmother had, that maybe was passed down from her grandmother. And so it's going to have that layer of symbolism and meaning that is unique to that person. And that's the way symbols work. There's many meanings. So the next section is called anchor images. And what I mean by an anchor image is that image or that metaphor that is going to be the main or anchoring image for the season. Now, let me give you an example here. Here is the logo for God Bless Us Everyone, the Redemption of Scrooge, which is I spent yesterday working on this series, so I'm like already in Advent Christmas in my head. um, but these are fully scripted worship services that I'm going to be making available on September 14th. Now, for an anchor image for this, one of the things that there are many symbols in the story, but the thing that really struck me, so to speak, were the bells. Every time the clock tower rings at a certain time during Scrooge's night of being visited by past, present, and future, a spirit shows up, right? And he has the opportunity to be transformed by what he sees and hears. And so the whole message of this Advent Christmas series is that each one of us can have a transformation. Each one of us can wake up in a new way to our lives and how our lives contribute to the whole. And so the bells became my anchor image, that thing which I really want to use as a major metaphor, because when the bell tolls, it can be a reminder of our own transformation. So some things that we could do visually for the series is that we could have bells, we could create bells, and we're giving you tons of ideas in this series about how to create bells, maybe not real ones, or maybe you have somebody in your congregation that has I grew up with my grandmother on the farm had the dinner bell, seriously, a dinner bell. And maybe you have somebody that has an old dinner bell that could bring that in. But you can also create them out of wire and lights and things to create a whole environment, perhaps where you're surrounded by the imagery of bells. Perhaps you hang smaller bells on strings and have that strung up against a wall somewhere that's prominent. But also you might want to get little bells that are inexpensive. You can buy them in bulk and give them out to each person for the series to put on their keychain so that every time they hear that little bell ring, or maybe they want to hang it on their visor, maybe they want to put it somewhere in their house. But every time that bell rings, they remember that they are steeped in this journey where transformation is possible, that through our faith, transformation is possible. Through the entrance into the world of this child, transformation was possible for the world. So that's an example of using an anchor image. All right, so here you might have then smaller metaphors that only visit for a week. For instance, the first week of the Scrooge series, Scrooge is visited first by Marley, his old partner in business. And Marley is a ghost, but he's got chains all over. And he says, "These are the chains forged in life, and I carry them around. Do yourself a favor, unchain yourself, in life while you have time." And so part of what we'll do in the first Sunday is during prayer time, have people write on a chain link, piece of chain, it's not real chain link, but ribbon or paper, something they'd like to unchain themselves from. And let them focus in a prayerful way on asking God to help them unchain themselves. So that would be just something added to the main visual installation for just that week in different ways. It could be in different ways. So that's an idea of what an anchor image is, and then you'll bring in other metaphors as well. Now, visual installations. That is, you can call them by many names. It could be what you have on a central table. It could be to the side in a corner. It could be hanging from the ceiling. But visual installations are anything visual that helps us to enter into the story in a deeper way. It's not just to make the space beautiful, although it might. But the main goal is to steep us in the story itself. That's why I never call visual arts just decorating the church, right? Because decorating is just really about making it pleasing to the eye. Well, we want it to be pleasing to the eye, but for a purpose. All right, so let's take a look. This is just a picture of a visual installation by my friend Todd Pick. Now, this was, he did this, obviously it's a communion sort of feel. And what it's alluding to is the abundance, right? The abundance of the table, because he's got abundant things here, lots and lots of things. But, in the book, I talk about Todd and some of his wisdom about design. Now, here's the thing, folks. You can take somebody who is, say, an HGTV addict, right? Home and garden television addict. We just love, that's me, love watching that because I love the way they talk about design and see it coming together and all the elements of design. You can take somebody who loves that, or somebody who just, you go to their home and it's just, there's some just beautiful arrangements of things. I'm doing this webinar today from in front of this bookshelf in my corner. And I'm doing it because the bookshelf is actually a place where I keep some things that I've collected from my journeys all over the world. And so you may have some people in your congregation who love to do just simple things like that. But they wouldn't even think, they're like, oh, create visual art for worship? Oh no, I don't know how to do that. Well, actually, with some very simple design terminology, some things to look for, you can turn those folks into visual designers for worship. You, as a theologian, perhaps pastors, you help steep them in the story and you talk about symbols with them. You talk about some of the colors and the textures that you think might work, and then let them do their magic. One of the things you'll see here in this picture from Todd is that he helps the eye to move. You'll notice it's not a cross in the middle with a Bible in front and two candles on either side, which is pretty static, right? He helps the eye to move. He uses odd numbers of groupings because he knows that odd numbers create asymmetry, and that helps the eye to move. He talks about levels, right? You can see all kinds of levels here. He talks about different textures together. So in the book, I really highly recommend you look at that, and I highly recommend then you go to the bonus materials to look at some more things, because I've got an interview with Todd in there, and it just will really help turn your folks into visual designers for worship. You don't have to wait until you have somebody who calls themselves a visual artist in your congregation to actually get some help doing this. So you also don't want to be too literal, okay? So I have a series in the Worship Design Studio called Busy. And it was originally meant for Lent. And it really takes a look at what is the cost of being busy, too busy in our lives. Now, when we think busy, we could think junk. We could think, oh, let's put a bunch of stuff in the sanctuary so it looks busy. Actually, sometimes we don't want to be so literal. What we want to be is the opposite of, give people the vision of. And in this series, Busy, I suggest that you do some flower arranging, not in your usual, perhaps effusive flowers, but in the Japanese art of ikebana arranging, where the spaces between are just as important as the things themselves. That could be a preaching point as well, right? And so sometimes we don't want to go to the obvious literal thing. We want to look at something else. So I also talk about that in the book. All right, so getting on along here, because I want to get to some of your questions and your comments. Moving visuals and dropline systems. Sometimes we think that the only visual thing we do in the space is something that sits on a table or in levels or what have you, but we can, or stuck against the wall with banners, but we can have visuals that actually fill the space in other ways. And one of those things is moving visuals. In other words, what are things that can move through the space to create energy? Here is a picture of, besides me with my mouth completely wide open, singing and leading worship. I really wish I had a different picture of these T-poles with ribbons on them. But this is the picture I have, so you get to look at my open mouth. You'll see that behind me are several of these moving banners. It's literally PVC pipe, one this way and one across a T as a T, and then with ribbons hanging down. Now you can drape fabric on these, you can drape all kinds of things on these. But one of the things you can do is, if you can imagine, right before this moment, all of these things came down the aisles. And as you walk down the aisles with them and the ribbons are fluttering behind, what incredible energy. And especially with the bright colors, we wanted to create a lot of energy all over the space. And it literally, it's like what filmmakers do when they decide that this part of the movie is about joy. And so they're going to use a palette of bright colors. They're going to have a camera that's going to move and sweep across the landscape, perhaps. And that's what you're doing as a visual artist by putting these things in people's hands and letting them walk through the space is you're creating that camera that sweeps across because it creates movement. Now, I wanted to also show you this because there are a lot of churches who have said, you know what, we are in this big, huge sanctuary. We have a small grouping of people on perhaps an early service. They're spread out all over the place, and the energy is just dead because people are just so spread out. So one of the things that I have helped many, many churches do is to create some of these very ribbon banners or T-pole banners, as we call them, with fabric, what have you. And then, they have stands. You can make that out of, concrete in a tub or wood or whatever you want to do. But then you put those across about halfway back in the pews so that the back row is about halfway forward. So everybody sits forward of that. You can use these things in so many different ways, friends. It is just so worth spending the money. And let me tell you what, it's not that much. PVC pipe, Home Depot, Lowe's, it's just not that much money to create these things. Anyway, so don't get me started. We don't have time for me to get started, but I just think there's so many uses and they bring such color to the space. You could even just have these along the walls to bring more color to your space, depending on what color fabric that you put on there. Okay, now here is a picture of a drop line system, a fabric hanging from the ceiling. Alexandra Childs is my go-to person around drop line systems, and I have an excerpt from my interview with her in the Think Like a Filmmaker bonus materials. So you don't want to miss this. If you're interested in bringing color and fabric to the air above the space in your sanctuaries, the idea is that you get up there once, you create a kind of pulley system. It doesn't actually use pulleys, but it's a system by which you can lower strings and attach things and pulley them back up to the ceiling. So you only have to get in once. You create a permanent system so that you have lots of different options and you can do things like this picture that you're seeing. Again, in that interview with Alexandra, I have many, many more pictures. Those of you who are members of the Worship Design Studio, we have an entire visual arts corner where we have articles and webinars and all kinds of interviews. Just there's so much more to be said than I can say in this short time together. Here's a more contemporary space. This is my friend Kim Miller's space at Ginghamsburg United Methodist Church. She creates enormous visual installations, right? So she has to do big things. And here she's just created out of a piece of wood and some rope these sort of strings that intersect for a series, a worship series that was about those crossing places, those intersections. I took this idea and did it in a smaller space where they had place to hang from the ceiling. Literally, a piece of wood, some rope, some boat rope, which is actually not that expensive, and you can get it in all kinds of colors. And we created this so-called stringed instrument that went from the ceiling down to the floor. And we actually had people plucking the strings as if they were playing a big harp. And we had the congregation singing tones that matched certain strings. Well, it was a musicians conference, so this was super easy to do with them, and it was fabulous. It was so cool. That's one example of visual arts and musical arts coming together. So many things you can do through drop-line systems, through using your imagination about other places to use visuals besides just on a table. Okay, getting down to the bottom, visual homiletics. In the book, you will read about my friend Ted Linden-Hatton, who uses visual arts not just as an accompaniment to the word proclaim, but as the word proclaimed. So in other words, he creates very provocative settings, visual settings, and he invites people to come and be in conversation about it as the sermon. So let me show you a picture here. This is a Good Friday setting that Ted did. And it is a table draped in black. There's candles all around it, but on blocks there is this broken piece of glass. And he has taken extra bits of broken glass, created this spiral that ends up the broken glass in a big hand, the hand of God holding the brokenness of the world. Now imagine in a Good Friday setting, bringing folks around that table. Now the lights are on to take a picture of this, but can you imagine this in the dark? Oh my goodness, spectacular. Gathering around that and talking about how God holds the brokenness of our lives and of the world. So this is visual arts in the service of the word in such a prophetic way. That's why he calls it visual homiletics, which is a word for preaching. So I just wanted to introduce you to that and to Ted in the book, because it's such a gift. And if you do have visual artists, people who call themselves visual artists, that would be interested in creating such an installation that would inspire and evoke conversation as part of kind of a dialogical sermon, pastors, partner with them and think about how you can do that. All right, finally, the final section of the book is called Collaborators. And already I've alluded to how visual artists can collaborate with the other arts. We've talked about how music came in that one suggestion, that one example of the strings, how preaching can be inspired by whatever the visual installation is, the anchor image, that kind of thing. This is a picture of from a Lent series that I did at a church a couple of years ago, and it was called Watch and Pray. And we created sort of stations that would be like the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. And all during Lent, people would write prayers on pieces of paper, roll them up, and put them in the crevices and cracks of these installations, which you can tell are pavers from Home Depot. My favorite liturgical shopping place, right? And just rocks from actually right outside the door at the church. And so sometimes visual artists can facilitate a decision that perhaps those who are focused on dramatic arts, and those are folks who are creating ritual action, like this kind of a prayer thing where you write on the paper and put it in there. Or the example that I already brought up of the chains, of writing what we'd like to be unchained from on something that comes from a chain link, paper chain, ribbon chain, what have you. So collaboration between visual artists and all the other arts is so, well, it's not just important, it's yummy. I'll just call it yummy. And I think it's why, even though I didn't start out as a visual artist, visual arts has become one of my passions. Because I see how it feeds into all of the other arts and can just bring worship alive. Whew, okay, so that is the outline of the chapter, what's in the chapter 3 of Think Like a Filmmaker. Of course, there is just so many more examples and explanations of what these things are than I can get to. That's why I wrote a book. So I really hope that you enjoy that chapter. If you're a pastor that would like to have visual help and you don't have that right now, just have somebody read that chapter with you that you think might, that loves HGTV or has an eye, their home is beautiful. Just read that chapter with them. Look at the bonus materials. I can't emphasize enough to go and look at those bonus materials because it will bring things to life and you'll go deeper and deeper into that. Become a member of the Worship Design Studio. We have so many training materials in there for visual artists as well as all the other arts. And in every one of our series that we produce, we give you ideas to jumpstart what you could do for visual arts. Join the reboot if you'd like. The reboot starts September 11th, and we are going to be talking about all of this. It's a great way to train your folks. Let me train your folks over 40 days. And you have access to the materials forever, so you don't have to do it in 40 days. But that's the time frame I'm going to use. Okay, so friends, questions, comments, ideas, things that you've done that your folks really loved, or things that you've done that people went bananas about. And I don't mean in a good way. That is something that happens with visual art sometimes because people are so used to the way things look And when you move their cheese, so to speak, then there's a reaction. Let me know. Okay, so Jenna, if you can be looking at those questions and give them to me. I see right now that Lisa has a question. Can you say something about incorporating screens into the visual milieu? Absolutely. I'm going to be talking more about the media arts in a couple of months because that's a couple of chapters down the road. But I can certainly say something about screens in terms of the visual look in the sanctuary. I want you all to know that screens with black outlines are no longer the only choice that you have to put screens in your sanctuary. There's so many ways to project things, so many different surfaces. So number one is if you have a light colored wall, anyway, don't even get a screen. Just project onto the wall because then it's there when you want it and it's not there when you don't. Another way to project is that now you can get big swaths of fabric. You hang it just like you would hang a banner, a big banner, and you project on that swath of fabric. It's called scrim. It's very lightweight. You get it at rosebrand.com. Just look up fabric scrim. Sorry, my nose is itching. Let me take a moment just to itch my nose. Welcome to my life and my allergies. Another thing you can do, there's all different kinds of materials. So you can also get lycra, stretch lycra. I have a great big piece of stretch lycra that I hang at various places. You know, if I don't know if I'm going to have a screen where I'm going, or if I want to create a projection surface somewhere that doesn't have a screen, stretch lycra is a fabulous, very reflective surface to project on. So there's so many different ways, aesthetically pleasing ways to project in your sanctuary other than having to find a spot where you have a screen, a big old screen. Now, having said all this, I want to tell you that I'm a big fan of using projections, but not just as information, but as inspiration. And you'll hear me talk about this in a couple of months when I do this webinar on the media chapter. It's so vitally important you use it as art because it is part of the visual palette. It's part of the overarching palette. And so one of the major ways that visual artists and media artists can collaborate is that when you create a visual installation, that you take photos just with your iPhone. I mean, it's so easy these days, and it takes great pictures. I use my iPhone all the time to take pictures. I put it in my iPhoto. I might fuzz the edges a little bit. I might enhance it. I might not. It might be just fine the way it is. And I use that as backdrops on the screens. I use it just as if I don't have any words on there and people just walk in and what they see in the visual installation is mirrored even larger on the screen or screens. Then, I mean, it used to be that we would tell visual artists, don't use anything very small because people can't see it out there. Well, that's still true in a general way. But we can also, now with projections, we can take photos of a small section of your visual installation. Or even think about this, a small detail in a stained glass window that's way up there that you don't really see with the naked eye. Let's say we take a picture of that, we put that on the screen. And that becomes a beautiful part of your overall palette. So it's really important that if you have some people creating backgrounds for slides, that you are in close communication with those folks so that you don't have competing palettes, right? So if you're using all blues and greens and then you get a red background for a slide, it's like, what? Because you haven't communicated. So this is why working in a team takes communication, and then it can really get cool. Rhonda, can you address avoiding conflict with traditional decorators? Our church is very traditional, just beginning to move in this direction, and are having a little resistance regarding Christmas and staging for Advent series as opposed to decorating. Okay, so what you may be talking about, especially around Christmas, right? Because we get our garland that goes just there, and we've left the hooks there so that it goes right on there. We have the Chrismon tree. We have all the things that we usually do. And you use the word traditional, and I want to just plant a seed for you. The root of the word tradition, the Latin root, is traditio. And what it literally means is to hand on or to surrender, not to hang on. So traditions are ever evolving. If traditions are not evolving, then what you get are museums, not churches, right? So the way that I don't know that you can avoid conflict, but you can always collaborate with different perspectives. And that's what we want to do in this instance. So we want to collaborate with different perspectives. So let's say you have somebody that does not want to give up the hanging garland just so. And you're going to do God Bless Us Everyone, the Redemption of Scrooge, and you want bells, the anchor image of bells. Well, instead of saying, well, we're not going to hang that garland, you add some bells hanging from it, perhaps, or hanging from the hanging points. How can you do both and, or how can you compromise? Compromise is not even the right word, right? Because that sort of feels kind of like we each had to give up something, which is not a bad thing, but collaborate. How can you collaborate into something that honors both things? It honors wanting to have that, and what people are, when they want the same thing, what they're looking for is that nostalgia, and they want the nostalgia because they had such an amazing spiritual experience with that. They want to have that again, and that's okay. That's an okay reason. But what our brains need to be reminded of, because our brains like for things to be the same, that feels safe. What our brains need to be reminded of is that even a new thing might bring a layer of meaning that will be so spiritually significant that you end up saying, oh my gosh, and we almost missed that because we weren't going to do that. So that's kind of, I don't know exactly what you're talking about. Maybe that helped. I hope that helped a little bit. It's always about thinking about both and, not just getting rid of, but how do we collaborate? We used a lantern that was brought in beginning of service while singing This Little Light of Mine each Sunday of Advent with the series about the light. Gave out pens with flashlight in them and church name and website on it. Awesome. Call it evangelism, call it publicity, doesn't matter. Fourth Sunday several years ago was great, though wasn't pastor's idea. So he killed it by saying something from the pulpit about getting tired of singing that same song. Of course, he did it 2 times each week. Used a different verse each week also. Well, he might be tired of it, but I can tell you through experience that many people love repetition. And I'm very sorry that things got undermined. When we work as a team, one of the things that we must do is be all in, whether or not it's our cup of tea. This is super important because I can guarantee you, even on a worship team, there are going to be people who like some things better than others. But you know what? Worship is not about what we like and don't like. It's about building up the body of Christ for its work in the world through encounter with the holy living God. And repetition is something that helps many people in many different ways. So I'm very, very sorry that happened to you. We need to be all in. We need to be supportive of each other's ideas, whether or not it's our cup of tea, because there will be things that are not necessarily our thing, but it doesn't mean that it's not meaningful for somebody else. And that's about a culture of radical hospitality. Now we're getting into chapter 9 with those comments. So maybe Deborah started chapter 9. Read that all together with your pastor. Okay. Jenna, do we have some other questions that I have missed?
Yeah, so there's a follow-up question from Lisa.
Okay.
She's wondering about having 2 big TV screens that are kind of permanent fixtures in the sanctuary. So going back to the idea of permanent fixtures that you want to work with and trying to figure out how to work around those things.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people, some churches, let's just say some churches went with TV screens because of all the light in their sanctuary. I understand that. It's not my favorite choice, the TV screens. But so when you have TV screens, one of the things that I say is never leave them just blank. They always have to have something on them that is helping to be part of the palette, because when they're blank and dark, they are more visible than if you have something in them. I also would play with softening the edges of those, perhaps with some fabric that goes with the fabric you have in your visual installations. Depends on how large they are or if it looks right. But sometimes I have played with softening the edges of those so they're not so TV-ish. So that's just something, always having something on there, because with something on there, it is more likely to blend in at times when they're not the focus than if you don't have anything on them. I do see Richard said we placed a screen in front of the lighted stained glass Jesus. Oh, to keep the negative comments down, we took a picture of the lighted stained glass and projected it on the screen while it's not being used for liturgy or music. Yay, Richard! That's exactly what I do. Absolutely, and I hope that worked for you. And it's a great thing to do, especially if you put something in front of something. Just take a picture of it, put it on there. Yeah. What else, Jenna?
That's all I'm seeing for right now.
Okay, great. Yes, and Deborah had a follow-up. Just wanted to highlight the power of the pastor's support or non-support. We all loved it. The pastor is no longer at our church. Okay. All right, working to collaborate. Terrific. Well, friends, it's been great to be with you on this webinar. Again, these are monthly webinars to talk about the book. If you have the book and you're benefiting from it, I would love for you to spread the word and let other people know about it. You can always send them to thinklikeafilmmaker.com, or you can send them right to the Amazon page. I've been seeing that some of you have been writing more reviews on Amazon. Thank you so much. It's helpful when people are, who don't know me or have never studied with me, are trying to decide about buying the book. It's great to have some people on there, telling their experience of it. I wanted to let you know that we have 2 more planning retreats left. We just got back from the one in Kennebunkport, Maine, my first one of the season, the planning retreat season, and we had an amazing time, friends. It is so amazing to get together with other churches. We had 36 churches from 13 different states. We had 4 different denominations, everybody from large churches to small churches. People who use lectionary, non-lectionary, just across the board, traditional, contemporary, emerging, all different, labels, I guess you would call it, styles of worship. And we went through the entire liturgical year, and we had an amazing time. We had some deeply spiritual worship as well. And so if you have any inclination and you would love to get ahead, in other words, go away from this retreat with plans sketched out for the year, and also have a time that is spiritually renewing and get a whole lot of work done. We have a few spots left in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Clayton, Georgia. It's just north of Atlanta. It's going to be spectacular. I think the leaves are maybe going to be starting to turn. We're at the highest point in the Blue Ridge Mountains, so it could be that the leaves are turning. Oh, I can't wait. And then we're going to be here in Lake Tahoe in October for that very same retreat. And would love to have you in my backyard, Lake Tahoe. Beautiful. The retreat center is right on the lake. And everybody who comes to my retreats here in Tahoe, just, it's such a great, I was going to say it's a once in a lifetime experience, but I have people coming back every year. So maybe it's not a once in a lifetime, but seeing Lake Tahoe is beautiful, as well as getting to plan for your year. So go to marciamcfee.com, click on events, Marcia Live, and it will have links there to both of those retreats. And then again, just want to let you know that September 14th, we're working on the final details right now. Our fully scripted Advent Christmas series is coming out. And not only to have Advent Christmas completely done for you, you'll want to tweak it a little bit to fit your context, but not only that, it's a great way to train your folks who are helping you, because we use all of these concepts that I teach in the book, all of these concepts in our series. And so it's great examples of what this is all about. And it gives you a sensory-rich series to do and get some experience with that. All right, friends. Woohoo! Thank you for being on. Great to be with you. I'll see you next month where we'll talk about Chapter 4, which is the verbal arts, thinking like a screenwriter. Thanks so much for thinking like an art director, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.